Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to inform you about great theories and discoveries that you probably have never heard of before. But if you did, they make a big impact on your life. And today is our 190th Bible Decode, and these are coming from the New Testament, and they are primarily featuring the Roman origins hypothesis, which I think is going to change the game and pretty much put an end to Christianity as well as Satanism. They go hand in hand with the New Testament, and it's going to do some very serious damage to Judaism as well, and really serious damage to Islam, and pretty serious damage also to atheism, or scientism, as they call it, because it seems like these Romans wrote a lot of documents, treatises, under pseudonyms, and they're not to be trusted. Many of the famous works of antiquity were written by some of these Romans, and many of the works that we regard as being sacrosanct, such as the works of Aristotle, and also the writing of Josephus. And he is, whoever he was, he is at the center of this Roman origins hypothesis. The idea is that the Romans wrote the New Testament. They wrote it as a psychological operation against the Jews. The Romans had just gotten done fighting the Jews in this war of the Jews, and this was the culmination of about 130 years of consecutive, constant uprisings, insurrections, revolts, and wars. And so this final war of the, not the final one, but the penultimate war of the Jews, at least in Judea, from 66 to 73 AD. The two generals, commanders for the Romans in this war, were General Vespasian and General Titus, father and son. Vespasian took over went to Jerusalem to quell the revolt in 66 AD, and when he was named the new emperor in 69 AD, he appointed his son Titus to continue the fighting, and Titus utterly destroyed Jerusalem limb from limb, so to speak, in 70 AD, and eventually wore down the Jews to the point where they surrendered or really mass suicide at Masada in 73 AD. And Titus then eventually becomes emperor when Vespasian dies in 79 AD. Titus's brother eventually becomes emperor in 81 AD when Titus dies. So these three emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, are called the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. And from 69 to 96 AD, they wrote the New Testament and backdated the story by 40 plus years, putting Jesus' ministry in the early 30s or late 20s AD. And they also wrote a history of the Jewish war between the Romans and the Jews. That came out in 7 volumes, and it's called War of the Jews by Josephus. Josephus is also known as Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty. He was an adopted member. Vespasian adopted him after he gave a successful prophecy to Vespasian about him eventually becoming the new emperor. Josephus was said to have been a Jewish priest that became one of the military commanders in this war, and he surrendered to Vespasian in about 67 AD at Jotapata. And he, when he surrendered to Vespasian, he recognized that now God favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans and then gave Vespasian this prophecy. Vespasian pardoned him when he did become emperor and brought him to Rome, gave him a townhouse at Caesar's palace, appointed him as one of the court historians, and sponsored him for writing this War of the Jews. So whoever Josephus was, if you believe that story, that tall tale, regardless, Josephus was fully an agent of Rome and fully emanated from Rome, where he lived the rest of his days, 30 or more years, 35 years. Now, if you read the two works side by side, the Gospels and Josephus's War of the Jews, you will recognize, if you know what to look for, you will recognize that they were written by the same hand or hands at the same time for the same reason. They are companion pieces, and they have too many parallels in them for it to be a coincidence. Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah, pointed out how the 3-year ministry of Jesus in Judea mirrors or is a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes. And they go to these places in the same order, and they encounter parallel events at these locations, and the timeline is 40 years apart. The events occur 40 years apart. And we're talking about several dozen events, like over 40, I believe like 45 or 46 events, all in the same order in both books. Not only that, but Jesus makes many prophecies in the New Testament that are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, including the major prophecy that he makes that says it's going to signal his second coming, which is the destruction of Jerusalem, that is fulfilled by Titus. Titus fulfills many of Jesus' prophecies, and that makes him the second coming of Jesus. So if you accept the words of Josephus, then Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And that's exactly what the Romans were intending to do. They use themes throughout Josephus talking about botany and grafting and homeopathy and domestication and pruning, taming. That's what they were doing with the Jews. The Jews were too wild. The Jews were out of control, especially with their military aggression against the Roman rule. And a lot of that was because of their God and their monotheistic beliefs, their beliefs that they were the chosen people, beliefs in all of these rituals that they had to follow and that they were willing to die to maintain, and that they were idiosyncratic and quirky, animal sacrifices, circumcision, kosher food laws, sanitary laws, and strictures against graven images, which the Caesars loved their graven images, statues of themselves. And so the Romans were trying to basically divert the Jewish tradition and have it culminate with Titus. So you know, the Jewish tradition goes down by blood from, you know, Adam to, you know, to Seth, to eventually to Noah, to Abraham, to David and Solomon, Moses, David and Solomon, and eventually all the way to Jesus, and then Titus. So that is kind of the psychological operation that the Romans were running. But also, they were trying to mellow out the Jews more in more pragmatic ways, because the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. The Jews were waiting for a military commander to help them throw off the Roman yoke. And so instead, the Romans wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah who was instead a prince of peace, and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pact, and so on. Also, Michael Menescot's just came out with a book from last year called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. He also dug into the book of Luke looking for parallels with the War of the Jews, and he found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke, totally saturated with parallels. Some of them are very, very strong. Some of them are, you know, could be dismissed as coincidental if there weren't so many of them. But he also graphs them out on a chart. He plots a point every place that there's a location. Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. After plotting 250 plus points, he made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, Titus Vespasian for the TV, and maybe the S. And not sure about the AP. But the main point is that the Romans signed their name to the book of Luke, and we still don't get it. And probably a lot of you followers of the 17th letter out there that have done absolutely no digging on any of this stuff will reject this, even though you are finding all of these codes and you're dedicating your life to decoding all this stuff, and you see this goes a million miles beyond any Q proof that I've ever seen, but you won't even look at it. Okay, so also the circumstantial evidence is totally there. This is exactly what the Romans would do. They were way into psychological warfare. They created a number of other religions in the first century for psychological warfare purposes. They had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, on distribution. They were the only people that even could have written the Gospels. And the Gospels are written in Greek, which is the language of the Roman commoners. And also all of the Roman royals. But the Roman royals also spoke Latin, APTVS. Whereas in Judea, very rare was a Greek speaker, much less a Greek writer. They all spoke in Aramaic, and very few of them read or wrote at all. And this is absolutely exactly what the Romans would do, and when you look at what Jesus did, you know, with all of the turn the other cheek and all of that, also he's taking a direct hit at the Jewish traditions, such as the money changers outside the temple to avoid the graven images being paid for the sacrifice and for the offering, and the excoriating the people, the Jews, the Jewish merchants selling the small animals for the animal sacrifice. So, and when he talks about the 10 Commandments, he only lists 5. So the Jesus created by the Romans is exactly what a Messiah created by the Romans would look like. He never, ever, ever does anything anti-Roman throughout the Gospels, and he does numerous attacks on the Jews. And Paul is even worse. And so this is exactly what a Roman psyop would look like, but you won't look at that. So now we went to a book of Christian apology from Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ. And he tries to make the case for Christ with a bunch of other scholars that he visits and asks them various questions, kind of in a legal format. And ironically, they don't know anything about the Roman origins hypothesis, and so they are not aware that the points that they're making when they make the case for Christ make an even better case for Caesar. They, a lot of times, they make their case, but they make it based on a case in absentia, like that, oh, well, there is no good explanation for this, and so the supernatural explanation is the best one. God did it, or, Jesus did it through God. And when you know about the Roman origins hypothesis, then there is a logical and easy and obvious explanation. Now we're looking at a kind of the opposite, a book from a more of an atheist perspective, which again I say that, atheism, or as also known as scientism, is even worse than Christianity, because Christianity, the Romans wanted you to be a good citizen. They wanted you to be a law-abiding, peace-loving, hard-working, honest citizen. And so Christianity, most Christians are that. Most Christians obey the law and are good citizens. But the people that are the atheists and the scientism, they believe in a completely false doctrine as well, with their, capitalizing climate change and capitalizing evolution and rolling up their sleeves without even questioning anything, and, just buying in hook, line, and sinker to any type of science that is pushed on them, regardless of how much money goes into, bribing people in order to get the studies that they need and so on. Going to the doctor for, just being a hypochondriac and kind of worshiping that profession. The problem with that is a lot of these atheists, not only are they buying into something that is fiction, but they're not good citizens. They're not even good citizens or law-abiding citizens or honest. They will flip something in 2 seconds if it's more pragmatic for them. So they don't even believe in principle. So anyway, this author who presents 10 Christian myths that, aren't myths, that 10 Christian things that Christians say that are actually myths, is kind of what he means, is also is ignorant of the Roman origins hypothesis, and thus he makes a lot of mistakes as well. This guy's name is David Fitzgerald. The book is called Nailed. And so I think we presented this last time, but Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians repeatedly warns Christians to beware of letters forged in Paul's name. That's in 2 Thessalonians 2:2. And ironically, most scholars agree that this letter itself is a forgery. So that's a pretty good forgery there. Majority of biblical scholars are now convinced that half the letters of Paul, I believe 6 of them, 6 of 13 of them, are forgeries, and also the epistles of James, Peter, John, and Jude are also seen to be forgeries. So that's 10 of the 27 books are forgeries, and then you have really Matthew is pretty much plagiarized from Mark. He said out of 661 verses in the book of Matthew, 607 of them are copied from Mark. And Luke is over half plagiarized from, I won't say plagiarized, just copied from Mark also. And then John even copies from Mark in a couple places. And Luke also copies from Matthew in a couple places. Now he's talking about Lee Strobel, the guy that wrote The Case for Christ in this book. Strobel crows that there is a mountain of Christian manuscripts compared to the anthills of Tacitus and Josephus. Tacitus and Josephus, they are the two earliest authors who mentioned the existence of Jesus. Now, they're both Roman royals, part of the Roman royal family, and so they can't be taken seriously once you understand the Roman origins hypothesis, that it's part of the psyop. But they are, and so what, not only Tacitus and Josephus, but also Pliny the Younger, and also Trajan, Emperor Trajan, and Suetonius, who was also later, I believe, an emperor called Antoninus Pius in the mid-2nd century. People might dispute that, but those are the only 5 people that have ever, in the first 100 years after Jesus was said to have been alive, have mentioned Jesus, and they're all from the Roman royal families. There isn't any evidence, any valid evidence for the existence of Jesus. There's exactly the same amount of evidence as there is for the existence of Santa Claus. Jesus is just Santa Claus for adults that haven't matured yet enough to recognize that this is a psychological operation. They can recognize psychological operations that occur in the 20th century or 21st century, the Kennedy assassination, 9/11, and so on and so forth, but they have not applied their knowledge to the ancient times because they believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and so they go into it without any type of critical eye whatsoever. Greek manuscripts of Homer's Iliad survive. However, as Earl Doherty aptly responds in challenging the verdict, multiplicity may be an asset, but it's also perfectly understandable in the case of the Gospels. First of all, there's more than a little irony hearing Christians bragging about the number of their scriptures that survived from antiquity, seeing that it was the early Christians who controlled what was preserved and what was lost. Yeah, well, that works both ways because the Romans were doing the same. So it both works to benefit Christianity. Much of the ancient world's classic literature was discarded or even put to the torch by the Christian West, along with a great deal of pious fraud as well. 200 and 300 years is a far cry from just a couple of generations. That's in Lee Strobel's book, one of the scholars does say just a couple of generations, and he's referring to like over 200 years. But what is really crazy about what Strobel is saying is that they talk about how many manuscripts are left. Well, some of them are just tiny fragments of manuscripts. One of the Gospel of John in the Rylands Library, it's called Papyrus 52. it's the earliest piece of any book of the New Testament we have, and it is like the size of a credit card, and there is not one single word on it that is complete. Or no, there's one. It's and, kai in Greek. And all the rest of the words are only fragments, but they've determined that it's the Gospel of John. No complete sentences, only one complete word. But they count that as one of the manuscripts. There is not a single New Testament manuscript, original or copy, not even a scrap, that can be dated to within the lifetime of any biblical character. And Strobel and Metzger conveniently fail to mention that the second oldest set of Christian fragments, Egerton Papyrus II, is from a completely unknown gospel. So for all we know, neither Homer nor the New or Old Testament are reliable. Exactly. That was kind of my point when I was going through the Strobel article originally. I didn't even know that he was referring to scraps and stuff. But the fact that there are more documents of the Bible or the New Testament than there are of, Tacitus or Josephus, that doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that there's more. It doesn't mean that it's true because there's more. It may mean both of them could be total fiction, which is the case. And the Tacitus is also total fiction. None of these things that the Romans were writing are true. That's what is going to really destroy Western civilization at a point in the near future, because they're going to recognize that a lot of the things that they have hanging their hat on for Western civilization are fraudulent, because they are pieces of this Roman origins hypothesis. The entire works of William Shakespeare, every one of his plays, he was actually a her, and you can read Joseph Atwill on this as well, and John Hudson. Every one of Shakespeare's plays is on the topic of the Romans wrote the New Testament. And so that is how you decode Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is now thrown on the whatever fiction or propaganda. It's really reverse propaganda. It was written by a Jewish woman named Amelia Bassano Lanier, and she was writing it as a counterattack against the Romans' original attack on the Jews. So she is targeting the Gentiles, whereas the New Testament was targeting the Jews. Now, really, though, the New Testament was also targeting the Gentiles, especially the slaves and the Roman soldiers. That was kind of in a later point. It took a couple generations for all of the books of the New Testament to have been written. So he says, this analogy boomerangs on apologists looking to defend historic evidence for Jesus, since few historians today believe that a single historical individual named Homer ever really existed either. Exactly. You're comparing favorably how many manuscripts there are left between the New Testament and Homer. We all know that Homer didn't exist. So why are you even making that comparison? But he says, who cares if we have 24,000 or even 24 million of these little late copies of copies of copies? We do not have even a single copy of any New Testament text from the time period that really matters, the formative period. Nobody was an eyewitness to anything. This is all here. The entire thing is hearsay, and that is why the case for Christ fails. Lack of evidence. Now he's going back to the inflated count of manuscripts again. it's a cheap trick Christian apologists play on the flock. A true count would ignore the later copies as irrelevant and only take into account the root manuscripts. How many of those do we have? There are only around 720 root texts for the New Testament, and most of those are medieval. Also, a large number of these 720 are not even complete books, much less complete Bibles, and a considerable number are not in the original language, but are translations into Latin, Georgic, Syriac, Ethiopic, Coptic, etc. Of all these, only about 14 or so date prior to 200 CE, and these are mostly mere scraps. Many of these fragments have fewer than 20 words, and in fact some don't have more than a few complete words. So this, if anything, I think the main point is that Christians really think that they have a lot more evidence than they really do. They think that they're on a much firmer ground than they are. Most Christians take it as, kind of automatic, that take it for granted that, there's plenty of evidence to back up what they're saying. And they will be able to use the names of Josephus and Tacitus to prove it. But the thing is that they have never read Josephus and Tacitus. And so they don't know that if you actually do read Josephus, he is, and you know what you're looking for, he is the evidence that will destroy Christianity ultimately. None of the early church figures show familiarity with the Gospels. St. Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement of Rome, which are, it's kind of interesting. All three of those people are said to have been pseudonyms of Roman royals. Clement of Rome was an outright member of the Flavians, and okay, now he's get to the next chapter. Does archaeology confirm the Gospels? Anonymous scribes who forge writings in their names, the authors of the Epistle of Barnabas, the Decode, or however you pronounce that, even the book of Revelation, all fail to mention the Gospels and show only very uncertain awareness of concepts from them. Justin Martyr is the first Christian who clearly quotes from a Gospel. I think he's early 2nd century, mid-2nd century, though he does not even identify any of them by name, simply referring, none of them had names until the